my mom would always say, hurting people hurt people.
Yeah.
So you can see that a little bit here just from the first chapter.
And again, it's a contrast between Elkanah and Peninnah. Peninnah sees what's going on with Hannah as a reason to despise her. Whereas
maybe instead of saying like, hey, don't let that get to you, I value you, I care about you, it's, hey, I'm more valuable than kids you could have, right? And it's less about the pain.
Nothing there yet.
I'll tell you about
technology.
Zoom experts.
Yeah.
You can all be for them.
It's not.
Yeah, it's so true.
Like it's only as smart as we are to know how to fix it when it breaks.
Okay.
I know.
Well, I don't know where it's gone, but I will add. And we're back. You're a little behind. Yeah, that's really annoying. Well, hopefully people will continue watching or catch the recording later. We'll have to keep an eye on that and see what happens. So getting back to Elkanah's, what he says to Hannah. Here's an interesting reference that colors the way I think about it. So when he says, am I not better to you than 10 sons? I think that's an allusion to Jacob and Rachel. So Rachel was barren and her rival had 10 sons, and yet she was the one that was actually the beloved one. And I wonder whether there's like an oblique gesture here to the fact that actually on the other side of the barrenness, those last two sons that came to Rachel were actually the more elevated, the more precious, the more influential. So maybe this is a way of Elkanah saying to her, you've got me and you've got faith. Like, I think God's still going to do something because you're just like another Rachel, in the same way that Elkanah might be like another Abraham figure who, he mirrors Abraham in that, he has a wife who's barren and then ends up with another woman in his household. So that's like Sarah and Hagar. And then like Abraham, he's going to have to give up his son, And so there's I think the allusions are kind of pulling us back into the Abraham, Isaac, Jacob story. Yeah. So I wonder if this actually shows how Elkanah's got some faith as well. And it's actually, there's a joint ownership of hope here, Hannah and Elkanah. So yeah, could be an interesting one. I don't know for sure. I'm not an Old Testament scholar. But I thought about the 10. I thought, oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
It is, yeah.
All right.
Yeah, never thought about that before.
Go on. One of you read a bit more.
Amber, you want to take it?
Yeah, we're in verse 9, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, verse 9. On one occasion, Hannah got up after they ate and drank at Shiloh. The priest Eli was sitting on a chair by the doorpost of the Lord's temple. Deeply hurt, Hannah prayed to the Lord and wept with many tears. Making a vow, she pleaded, Lord of armies, if you will take notice of your servant's affliction, remember and not forget me, and give your servant a son. I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and his hair will never be cut. While she continued praying in the Lord's presence, Eli watched her mouth. Hannah was praying silently, and though her lips were moving, her voice could not be heard. Eli thought she was drunk and said to her, How long are you going to be drunk? Get rid of your wine. No, my lord, Hannah replied. I am a woman with a broken heart. I haven't had any wine or beer. I've been pouring out my heart before the Lord. Don't think of me as a wicked woman. I've been praying from the depth of my anguish and resentment. Eli responded, Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant the request you've made of him. May your servant find favor with you, she replied. Then Hannah went on her way. She ate and no longer looked despondent. So
this is a game of two halves, this one. Hannah's doing, I mean, this is really cool. Hannah's prayer, Hannah's faith, but also Eli's ineptitude, his lack of discernment.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like just sticks his foot in it here, which is pretty bad as well.
I think it's interesting, and I'm just going to make a quick comment on this. You see that Hannah ate and was no longer despondent, or looked no longer despondent anyway, before you hear anything else about her journey, before God answers anything, says anything. Things shifted after her time with the Lord. I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, that's so huge. Like she walked out of that encounter as if she had victory.
Mm-hmm.
But actually the reality of that victory hadn't arrived yet. But she was able to interact with her world as if something had changed in faith. And that victory was won because she prayed. And it actually, we say prayed, but actually she prays and she makes a vow. So she commits herself to the Lord.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah.
there's some really unique stuff about Hannah and her prayer, actually, which is cool. What were you
I think
gonna say?
something. You guys heard that?
Yep.
Oh my gosh. I live in a neighborhood. No one should be going that fast. Anyways, so I wanted to mention that his hair will never be cut.
Yeah.
So that is in reference to a Nazirite vow. And so at the time, there were two groups of people that could serve at the temple or the tabernacle, and those were Levites, or born into the tribe of Levi. But if you weren't from that tribe and you wanted to serve with a greater level of commitment, another option was to become a Nazirite. And so for the ancient Jewish people, one of the greatest ways they could show devotion to God was by taking a Nazirite vow. So it's like serving like a holy priesthood. And so one of the things you couldn't do was drink alcohol, and another was that you couldn't shave your head. And so that right there, her saying his hair will never be cut, is a signal to be brought back into the Nazirite vow commitment that she's making to God, that essentially saying, like, if you give me my heart's desire, I will like sacrifice my heart's desire back to you so that he would serve faithfully in the temple. I mean, and after that child was weaned, he would live essentially at the temple, dedicating his whole life to serve God. So it's a huge, it's not a small dedication taking place here. It's a rather monumental one.
Yeah.
And for reference of someone who we've seen already at this point, who's lived Nazirite, like lived their life under the Nazirite vow, is Samson. But one thing about that is that also, if we have that context in mind, we're like, oh, last time this promise was made about someone, and it didn't turn out so well. He kind of disobeyed that vow at every turn.
Every turn.
Yeah. So
actually, this was probably about a year ago, we did a podcast on Samson. Do you remember that?
I do.
Yeah. So here's some interesting things about Hannah's prayer. So actually in verse 3, this is the first time in the Hebrew Bible that the phrase "the Lord Almighty" is used. And Hannah is the first person to address Yahweh as the Lord Almighty, or the Lord of Hosts. And it's this phrase that kind of refers to an acknowledgement that in the whole scheme, in the whole hierarchy of creation, you've got like spiritual powers who sit over human powers, who sit over nations, who sit over tribes. There's this whole pyramid that God is at the top. Like God's the ultimate one with all the authority, with all the power. And so Hannah's like, she's this theologian. It's almost like she's portrayed in the development of the Hebrew Bible as a woman who has like original spiritual theological insight. And it's out of her mouth that like a new way of relating to Yahweh is brought into the fold. So that's really cool. She also, I think she might be the only woman in the Old Testament to actually converse with Yahweh, to actually speak to Yahweh. And she's also the only woman in the Old Testament to make a vow. I mean, there may have been
Hmm.
loads of women who made vows, but she's the only one recorded who made and kept a vow.
Hmm.
So she's like, in the whole of the Hebrew Bible, she's elevated as this like unique character who just, her spiritual relationship with Yahweh is really preeminent. It's like we would miss these details, but for looking them up in commentaries or comparing with the rest of the Bible assiduously all the time. But
Hmm.
I think that's really exciting that she's such a profound character. And then the way she characterizes herself as like your servant, like over and over again, like she postures herself in humility.
Yeah.
And then she relates in this kind of covenantal way. So she understands the kind of God that Yahweh is. He's not an ATM machine, but I need to commit myself to Yahweh if I'm going to ask Yahweh to do something for me. I need to put myself in covenant with him, which is what a vow was. So like she gets who Yahweh is and how Yahweh does stuff. And so her prayer just fits. Like it's if I don't know, she's just like that person who could teach a prayer class. Like she clearly understands how to do it.
Yeah. I like that you say that, Richard, because I've always been struck by the parallel of Mary in the New Testament and Hannah in the Old. And one of the things, another similarity that you're bringing up that I haven't even connected before is the like theological depth that both of them carry. Like in Mary's, in a lot of Mary's words and in her songs, she kind of declares back to God who he is with a very rich understanding of him and a deep knowledge of the scriptures. And so there's yet again another correlation because Hannah has a prayer and Mary has a prayer, and they're often contrasted against each other in a lot of commentaries. But I had never made even the like heart posture and connection with just their love for God and their deep relational capacity to understand him and to worship him because of their understanding.
Yeah. And that's contrasted again then with Eli. So Hannah's got this like personal relationship. She knows a name of God that other people aren't even using yet. And how does Eli refer to God? Not as my God or anything like that, but as the God of Israel.
Yeah.
Eli is just not personally invested in the relationship. He's like a professional priest. He's doing his duty, not very well, but he's like, he's the pro pastor who doesn't actually know God himself. He's someone else's God.
Yeah. And that contrast with a woman who is an outcast because she's a woman, an outcast amongst women because she can't do the thing that women are supposed to do.
Yeah.
Having
and
a personal relationship
as well.
Yeah.
So not in the city, but a rural farm, farm woman.
Because they have to walk to travel to the temple. And not in comparison with someone who is professionally supposed to have a deep connection with God. It's just a funny contrast.
Yeah.
Did we stop at
No, go on.
No, did we stop at verse 11? I don't want to jump ahead.
I think, didn't you read all the way down to verse 18?
18
yeah.
through 18, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think another thing that stands out to me is kind of that grace and truth that Hannah balances so well as she confronts Eli. It's not in an aggressive way, but she absolutely finds her voice. Like she is able to advocate for the fact that no, she's not drunk, she's not committing sin in the presence of God by drinking at the temple. She's actually praying in a very intimate way and is able to advocate for herself and her intimate relationship with the Lord while still respecting Eli. Like there's no sign of blatant disrespect there. She says, no, my Lord, and just kind of explains her circumstances. I haven't been drinking wine or beer. I've been pouring out my heart before the Lord. Don't think of me as a wicked woman. I've been praying from the depth of my anguish. I just think that's so beautiful.
If I was having like a vulnerable moment like that and Eli interrupted me, I would have had some choice words and they would not want to write down.
yeah, it's just like, you're just like, get away from me. I'm trying to talk to God. And she's just, yeah, she's balancing so well this, like not being so timid that she doesn't explain and advocate for the fact that she's not drunk. She absolutely, advocates for herself, but she does it in a gracious way. I've always been struck by that.
Yeah, yeah. And I like the way that she prays in silence as well.
Yeah.
So when she's got a need, and of all the times you would want to broadcast help me, she actually is only turning to the Lord, and she doesn't even want anyone else to hear. And later on, when she prays her prayer of thanksgiving, she prays it out loud, but often for us it's the other way around. If we've got a need, we're on Facebook, hey everyone, pray for me, I need a new job, but then the thanksgiving is the private part, where it just strikes me it's so different to what we often see. Yeah.
What is it that you noticed?
Oh, I was just going to say, I think something too that's interesting is, Richard, you mentioned at the beginning of like speaking about this little section we just read, is just like kind of the ultimate like lack of discernment of the whole situation with Eli. And one of the things is that I noticed, so, Hannah is kind of like, oh, I'm not drunk. Don't consider me this worthless woman. And so the word that she uses there for worthless behind it is baliyal. And then in 2:12, the interesting thing is, so she discerns that like he's thinking of her as this worthless woman. And then in chapter 2, verse 12, the author narrates the fact that the sons of Eli were worthless men. Yeah. And uses that same word. And the thing is, as we'll see, like Eli had no idea the worthlessness of his sons as like keeping the temple and serving the temple. And yet he comes in and he sees this woman who actually is this woman with a heart for God and praying and pouring herself out before the Lord. And he just automatically assumes that she's this worthless, drunk woman who's desecrating the temple.
Yeah.
It just, his lack of discernment in serving the Lord throughout this is like, he's just not present.
Yeah. In fact, he's portrayed as someone who can't distinguish between appearance and reality.
Exactly. Yep. Yeah.
That's very well put.
Yeah.
So doesn't really have much spiritual sight.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And it's interesting because then as his life progressed, he's portrayed as being blind. Right. So we get all these overtones, all this physical imagery that speaks to actually the spiritual reality. Yeah. And powerless. He's also portrayed as being powerless. Like he can't influence or change anyone. And yet you've got Hannah influencing Yahweh.
Yeah, which is so fascinating that you bring up all this language, because all of this is language that throughout scripture is used to talk about like pagan idols. And then Israel, whenever they're being, kind of deaf to the Lord's voice and blind to what the Lord is doing, and are not actually acting in the Lord's power. Those are the sorts of metaphors that are used. Like they're blind, they're spiritually blind, they're deaf, they're powerless, which is the words actually used of pagan idols. Like they're made out of stone and they're carved in these images of having eyes but actually can't see, having ears but actually can't hear, and are revered as having power but can't. So whenever all this language is being used of Eli, it's like he is actually this pagan idol that's been set up in the temple to do temple service, but in fact he's a pagan kind of idol set up in the holy temple of Yahweh and desecrating it by his very presence of this man.
We're going to see this theme continue. Like we haven't read this. I don't even know if we'll get to this evening. It might be next week. But like Hophni and Phinehas are sleeping with the women who serve at the gate of the temple. And so, which is a common cultural practice in paganism. So it's another echo that actually the decline of the house of Eli is that they did not know the Lord. they're not following the way of the Lord, and they've replaced it with the way of paganism that surrounds them. And it's just, which is interesting, if you're not pursuing what does God want, if you're not displaying the kind of faithfulness and intentionality that Hannah and Elkanah do, then you're going to end up with some kind of rhythm, some kind of authority, some kind of routine, and Hophni and Phinehas epitomize like the decline of where that road ends up. And there's this kind of, mirrors bits of Leviticus and the kind of end of Deuteronomy, like the blessing and the curse of like, if you follow the Lord and commit yourself and are faithful to him and his ways, you'll get life. And if not, well, that's what happened to Hophni and Phinehas. They had death, Yeah, so Eli, it's interesting because like his professionalism is once he's told what's going on, he says the right kind of thing.
Like he like snaps into tradition, like what he's supposed to say. It's almost like I just keep thinking about, he just seems really checked out. And so she's like, no, that's not what's happening. Just so you know. He's like, oh, okay, well then be on your way, go in peace. He just kind of just brushes her off almost, it feels like, compared to what he had said. We don't get a lot of what he said in the text, but compared to what he said previously, it's like he completely shifts his attitude towards her, which to me it shows less that he's really concerned in his doing his priestly role, but more just in the fact that he's like, oh, okay, well, that's fine then. And it just, that checked out. He's just going through the motions as what seems fitting in his eyes to what he's seeing.
Yeah. I wonder if another thing that's going on here is the reason he presumed she was drunk is because at festival times there was a problem with drunkenness. What was supposed to be a holy convocation had turned into a party. Because that's interesting, because one of the themes of Eli is he knows what's wrong, but he's powerless to do anything about it. And so the sort of irony that he would berate this woman for a problem that he knows is going on, and yet cannot control his sons who are doing much, much worse things, but he knows they're doing that too. And so there's this kind of interesting favoritism going on, which is one of the kind of like theological themes of the beginning of Samuel here. Like there's privilege and position is no substitute for purity and faithfulness.
Right.
Yeah. And then there's you mentioned like the important words. There's a little pun at the end here as well on Hannah's name. So Hannah is woman of grace. And so the woman of grace graciously says, may I find grace? But she is the woman of grace. And so there's, the way that the writer is writing the story is kind of interesting, because I think it's poking at the irony of, Eli pronounces a blessing, but he was the last person in the world who really had any power to bless.
Yeah.
And Hannah had everything she needed in a relationship with God already because of who she was. And so there's like the irony in that pun is really telling. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Let's see if we can finish chapter 1.
Sure.
Which is.
Do you want me to finish it off reading?
Yeah, go on, read a bit more.
The next morning, Elkanah and Hannah got up early to worship before the Lord. Afterward, they returned home to Ramah. Then Elkanah was intimate with his wife Hannah, and the Lord remembered her. After some time, Hannah conceived and gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, because she said, I requested him from the Lord. When Elkanah and all his household went up to make the annual sacrifice and his vow offering to the Lord, Hannah did not go and explained to her husband, after the child is weaned, I will take him to appear in the Lord's presence and to stay there permanently. Her husband Elkanah replied, do what you think is best, and stay here until you've weaned him. May the Lord confirm your word. So Hannah stayed there and nursed her son while she weaned him. When she had weaned him, she took him with her to Shiloh, as well as a 3-year-old bull, a half bushel of flour, and a clay jar of wine. Though the boy was still young, she took him to the Lord's house at Shiloh. Then they slaughtered the bull and brought the boy to Eli. Please, my lord, she said, as surely as you live, my lord, I am the woman who stood here beside you praying to the Lord. I prayed for this boy, and since the Lord gave me what I asked him for, I now give this boy to the Lord. For as long as he lives, he is given to the Lord. Then he worshipped the Lord there.
Okay. So, I mean, some of this is kind of the self-explanatory story, isn't it? But the thing that struck me was the phrase, "The Lord remembered her," because in English culture, we read those words and we kind of picture like God's in heaven. And he's like, "Oh yeah, Hannah, I'd forgotten. Like, oh, I better do something." But actually, the way this phrase is used consistently in the Old Testament is there comes a point when God wants to move his covenant story forward. And this phrase, this recurring phrase is like, "And God remembered." And it's this kind of, not that God had forgotten, but almost like, and God pulled into the forefront of his mind what he wanted to do with Hannah. You know, it's this kind of like God's focusing his promises and his action and his story through someone he wants to work with. And Hannah is that person. And so this like really theological covenant phrase is used, and it kind of, you know, it gets used of, you know, like God remembers Abraham and even remembers Lot and remembers the Israelites when they're in Egypt, and, you know, like, but here's just this, again, this nobody woman, and like it gets used of her, and so she comes into the foreground of the story. So yeah, I like that. And I like the fact that she doesn't, like, she's not making a big deal of it. She's not parading Samuel around the streets. She just, she keeps him at home. She weans him. We're going to see in chapter 2, she takes him to the temple, drops him off, and still like has a connection with him, and, you know, brings him a new robe every year and visits with him. And, you know, like Samuel's still her kid, still in her heart.
And I think that's huge, because we see that clearly her identity, that almost solidifies the fact that her identity is rooted in not her ability to have kids, but in the Lord. Because if it was in her ability to have a kid and a son, no less, wouldn't she want to then make sure everybody knew that, look what I have now, look I'm valuable now. And she doesn't. She's just like, this belongs to the Lord. And I think that's a huge testament to what we were talking about earlier, that she really didn't know where her value was. And that's a thing for us to learn from, right? That when we receive from the Lord, or when we get opportunity, or when we get blessing, not putting who we are in that, and saying, this is a gift from the Lord. What I do with what I've been given is I give it right back, and I don't make a big show of it. It's a really humbling thing to see her do that in a time where she really didn't have value in the eyes of others unless she had this son, for her to then say, no, but the son belongs to the Lord. This isn't mine to parade around. And also, Richard, what you said about her kind of being like an echo of Rachel. Another time we see the Lord remember somebody is he remembered Rachel in Genesis 30:22 when he opened her womb too. So we do see that echo and connection there. And I think that it's interesting, because God remembers people when they're in distress, because he also remembered Noah in Genesis 8 when he was on the boat in the middle of the flood, that God remembered him then too. So I think that's just helpful for us now, as we're kind of going through this really tumultuous time as the world, really not just as a nation, but also as the world, is remembering God does remember us in this. He's not forgotten us. And we see in scripture lots of times he seems to remember us specifically, like points out that he's thinking about us when we're in the middle of chaos and when we feel like hope is lost. Obviously, he always remembers us, but he reminds us that he remembers us when we need it the most.
Yeah. Actually, Seaton on Facebook has just posted that of like the Hebrew word zakar. And it's not just bringing someone to mind that's a part of this word, but also acting on their behalf. And I like that, because that's that kind of thing, you know, we often talk about prayer, like, oh yeah, God always hears. Yeah, but hearing for God also means doing something. God doesn't hear and think, yeah, I'll put a pin in that, I'll make a note of it, and maybe I'll get around to it if I feel like it. No, like if God's connecting with you to hear you, God's going to connect with you to act as well. And
that's what we see too, because literally in Genesis 8, it's the Lord remembered Noah and he caused a wind, and then the Lord remembered Rachel and he opened her womb. And so you're definitely seeing that action.
Yeah.
And God's call for the people to remember things was always a call to like remember what the Lord had done, and then to act from that remembrance of how the Lord had been faithful to his covenant with them. So there's remembering and memory for the Hebrew people was more than just that kind of cognitive like thought process, but more about ritual too, and the way they enacted this kind of cyclical pattern of what the Lord was doing in and through the people and in and through his world.
And the thing you said, first of all, Amber, about, I just think about it, like if God blessed one of us with some kind of miraculous provision, there would be something in our culture that would make us want to parade it around, not because of the Lord's fame or any desire to honor God or encourage people, although that could be there. But the thing I'm talking about is we would think, oh, this is a way for me to like gain influence, to gain power, to gain prestige, which will then enable me to go do something. But for Hannah, she had the thing she asked for, and that was enough. And she was settled that God had given her what she had asked for. And so it's interesting then, because she is this monumentally influential person who takes us from Judges to King David. And how does she do it? Like, how does she get all that influence? And the last female leader we had was Deborah, who was this politically savvy, great military leader. Like, no, Hannah does it actually. The only tools at her disposal are gentle quietness and motherhood. And I just see this as God like elevating that and saying, yeah, I use that as a mega important thing that I wanted to do. And which is so countercultural. Like, even, I mean, Hannah praying is countercultural, but even we get the phrase of like, and God heard. So like, here's Yahweh wanting to let everyone know, not only can women pray to me, but I actually answer women when they pray to me. You know, so there's so much that God is doing to elevate, not just Hannah, but to just broaden the gates of like who can be invited in to this kind of relationship as well.
Yeah, it's good.
And then we finish with a bit of Elkanah as well, which I like. So Hannah, I like the way that Hannah's calling the shots. So Elkanah's this like spiritual leader in his family, like, hey, all of us need to go worship. But Hannah says, actually, I want to do this different thing. I want to wean the child, and I want to actually give him permanently to the Lord. And Elkanah, and it's interesting because there's actually provision in the law, I think it's Numbers 30, for a husband to veto a vow that a woman has made. And so Elkanah doesn't. He doesn't veto. And there's no, like, this is the son from his beloved wife. There's no way naturally he's going to want to give up this child. But he's like, no, you've made a vow. This is something that you're doing, that God's leading you in. I support you. And so I like the way that he supports her. And then it's Hannah is the one who chooses when to bring the child. She brings him to the temple. She brings the offering. And so, at no point does it turn into Elkanah's thing. Like, Hannah's doing this, and even in a culture that's so deeply patriarchal, Elkanah is like supporting his wife and allowing her room to fulfill her vow and do what the Lord's leading her to do, which is really cool. And she's doing like big, generous, like she's spending all this money. Like to bring a bull to redeem a child, the offering was 5 shekels of silver. She's brought a whole bull. And when you bring a bull to sacrifice, you're supposed to bring a third of an ephah of flour and half a hin of oil. And she's brought twice as much as needed and 3 times as much flour as needed.
Mm.
So if we were used to these amounts, we'd be reading this and be like, whoa, she's bringing like 2 or 3 times more than is needed, you know? So, you know, the prudent fiscal husband will probably be like, hang on, like I don't think you need to spend that much on this. But again, he just supports her, the choices she's making here, even of radical generosity, which is pretty cool. I also wonder about, you know, Hannah's faith that God will care for this child. Because to get this precious child and give the child up, that's a big deal. But to give the child up to Eli, who must be known as a bit of a numpty, like
his fathering,
he's a couple of strings short of a
Yeah,
guitar,
exactly.
so
He hasn't fathered very well.
yeah. I'd be like, okay, I will give this child to the Lord when there's someone who's actually going to represent the Lord.
Right.
Yeah.
But that's not the call she makes. She's like, you know what? This Shiloh is where God right now is centering, meeting with his people. And so that's all I can do. So even in the imperfectness of the circumstances, Hannah's like, let's just do our best to follow what God's called me to do. So there's huge faith in that as well, I think, and courage.
It's good to slow down and notice these details. I mean, we were just talking yesterday, Ryan and I were with some other people about, over Zoom, don't worry, talking about how when we read scripture for mileage, we sometimes miss these things, especially when in our culture we don't understand the devaluing of women that took place at this time. So when we read about a woman, we're like, oh yeah, so a woman talked to God and had a kid and gave the kid to God, but we don't really understand the depth of the statement God's making by in all of these details of Hannah's story, of Hannah's faith. Like we don't notice the faith, we don't notice the generosity, we don't notice the actions that she takes with the Lord. When we're reading so fast and not thinking about all this, it's really good to just take some time and say, okay, but what is going on here? Like, sure, she took, because again, reading this at face value, you see that she took all of these things to sacrifice. But again, unless you stop and you remember the other parts of the Old Testament, this was way more than she needed. And what does that mean? And asking these sorts of questions and talking about them is just really fruitful to see the heart of the Lord and the Holy Spirit in the text and in this story. It's just really cool.
Yeah. I love the phrase that Elkanah uses to his wife, do what seems best to you, which is a really like other-centered, I give you the reins of this decision phrase. You know, wait until you've weaned him. So like, yes, I affirm what you've said is your choice. This isn't some passive aggressive, I think you should rethink it and then do what seems best to you. And then he just says, only, like, here's my only concern. May the Lord establish his word.
Yeah.
Which again makes me think Elkanah and Hannah must have had some joint sense that God was going to do something. And so Elkanah's only concern is, let's see what God's going to do. And then the last phrase of this chapter is about Samuel, and he worshipped the Lord there. So you've got Eli and his sons inhibiting worship by coercing meat out of the people that was intended for sacrifice. There's sex trafficking going on in the temple. Eli doesn't know the Lord. Hophni and Phinehas don't know the Lord. Like it's stated for them, insinuated for Eli. Like you're looking around and you're just like, where on earth is Yahweh? This looks like the end of the book of Judges. Where on earth is Yahweh? And yet Samuel, a small child, is able to commit himself and worship, to connect with God and commit himself to God in the midst of all of that. And
that hope, it's that, breath of fresh air, seeing, okay, not all hope is lost.
Yeah.
We're not completely in the dark.
Yeah.
And since we have given kind of the meanings of the other major characters' names, again, to kind of go back to as we talked about, like how this becomes like the upswing, that kind of like pointing towards the hope of everything negative about disobedience and Judges, is that the name of the child is Shemuel, which is like an obedient one to God. So it comes from Shema, which is to hear or to obey the Lord.
Yeah.
And
it's interesting because the Hebrew word as well is a play on the Hebrew word for ask. So his name sounds like the name asked of the Lord as well. So there's this, all these echoes, like clever literary echoes built into his name, which is really cool. Yeah. Okay, well, that's the end of the chapter, and we've talked for about an hour, and we lost some people because technology is really hard.
Oh, it's okay. We're recording this so they can watch
but
it
we're
back.
recording it. So if you're watching the recording, we're sorry that we lost you, and hope that doesn't happen again. And if you're watching this, we now got to the end. We're going to do this every Wednesday, 6:30, about an hour. We've gone an hour and a quarter today, about an hour-ish. And just invite you to be reading along 1 Samuel with us. I'd say read a few chapters, but maybe a chapter's enough. I don't know if we're going to speed up.
I know.
And let us know what you think, and stay in touch. And hope you guys are blessed and encouraged. And keep digging in the Word. Like, God's so much to reveal and show how good He is, and show what it looks like when humans follow Him, and the repercussions of that, to encourage us to do the same.
Yeah, and I would say too, as you've watched either this, you're now at the end of the recorded and just posted one, or as you're getting ready to join us for the other ones, remember, feel free to ask questions or make the comments as we're doing it. Ask questions on this one still, even if you're watching afterwards, we can still see those comments and try and pick them up for next week and things like that.
Yeah, I think even too, we've got a House of Learning email, correct? We do. You can email HOL
at westsideajc.org.
Yeah.
If that doesn't work, you can always go on the website and look for any of our photos and send us an email as well.
Yep. Exactly. We would love to engage with you. We want this to not only just be a space where we can nerd out on how cool God's scriptures are, but actually a place of connection and community for those of you who are hungry for that. So just reach out. We would love to get connected with you.
Yeah. All right, I'm going to pray quickly. So Jesus, thank you for your word. Encourage us, stir us up, keep speaking to us. Thank you for the way that you worked with Hannah, especially, but Elkanah as well. And we're going to get into Samuel. And thank you for just raising up such amazing people and recording their lives for us to encourage us. Help us figure out what it is about our situation right now and our lives and what you're doing in our story that overlaps in any way with this story, and speak truth into our lives. Show us how to alter course to be in line with the route that's going to be blessed and is going to bless others.
Yes.
Amen.
Amen.
All right. Well, thanks for watching, everyone. And we will hopefully catch you next week.
Yes.